All right, let's dive right in. If you're a Year 9 history student gearing up for your exams, or honestly just someone fascinated by how entire societies can completely collapse and rebuild themselves from the ground up, you are in the exact right place. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're exploring the outbreak of the French Revolution. We're going to look at how a totally broke government and a literally starving population created the absolute perfect storm back in 1789. It's a wild story of desperation, deeply unfair politics, and a massive fortress being torn down brick by brick.
So the first absolutely crucial thing to understand is that the French Revolution didn't just happen overnight, right? You don't just wake up one random morning and decide to overthrow a monarchy that's been in charge for centuries. France in 1789 was essentially a giant ticking time bomb. It was the explosive result of long-term problems that had been simmering for years, violently crashing into a massive sudden crisis. The conditions were set, the pressure was maxed out, and the whole country was just waiting for a spark.
Here is how we're breaking this down today. First, a ticking time bomb. Second, the Great Bread Crisis. Third, a rigged voting system. And finally, storming the Bastille.
Part 1. A ticking time bomb.
Think of it like a recipe for a revolution. You start with these incredibly deep, long-term issues, a government that is completely flat-out broke, layered on top of a society that is fundamentally unfair. But honestly, that alone isn't always enough to start a revolution. You need a catalyst. When you mix that broke king and that unfair society with a sudden massive yearly crisis, well, an explosion is guaranteed. The spark that finally set it all off was this crazy combination of three things crashing together all at once: socioeconomics, broken politics, and entirely new ways of thinking.
Moving on to part 2, the Great Bread Crisis.
It's almost like the weather itself was conspiring against the French people. Before 1788, these freak summer hailstorms just absolutely decimated the crops. And then nature follows that up with the winter of 1788, which was literally recorded as the coldest winter in human memory. So you've got destroyed crops, followed by a brutal freeze. That meant a terrible harvest. By the time we hit the summer of 1789, food is incredibly scarce, and the price of whatever food is actually left, specifically bread, is soaring right through the roof.
80%. I really want you to stop and just imagine that number for a second. By the summer of 1789, ordinary workers were spending up to 80% of their daily money just to buy a single loaf of bread. Think about your own daily income or allowance, and imagine taking 80% of it just to secure enough bread to keep yourself from starving for one day. That leaves almost nothing for rent, clothing, or taking care of your family. And there's a huge domino effect here, because people were spending absolutely all their money on bread. They weren't buying anything else. As a direct result, factories began closing down. Thousands of people lost their jobs on top of not being able to afford food. So the people in France weren't just a little upset or frustrated with the economy. They were desperate. The streets were filling up with angry crowds who were literally fighting for their lives against starvation. Empty bellies create desperate measures, for sure.
Which brings us to part 3, a rigged voting system.
Remember how we said the government was broke? Well, King Louis XVI had completely, 100% run out of money. He desperately needed cash. To get it, he had to call this giant meeting called the Estates General in May 1789. It was basically a massive parliament made up of the 3 estates of France. Sounds like a really great democratic solution, right? Bringing everyone together to figure out the financial crisis. But as we're about to see, the rules of this game were incredibly unfair.
Just think about the sheer demographics of France at the time. The Third Estate, which were the common, everyday people, made up a massive 98% of the entire French population. On the flip side, the First and Second Estates, the incredibly wealthy clergy and the nobles, made up just a tiny 2%. So 98% versus 2%. Keep those numbers in the back of your head. Because here is the kicker. Here's how the voting actually worked at this giant parliament. Each estate only got 1 vote in total. This meant the First Estate got 1 vote and the Second Estate got 1 vote. Those top 2% of the population would always just team up to protect their own wealth, giving them 2 votes. Meanwhile, the Third Estate, which represented 98% of the actual human beings living in France, only got 1 single vote. That 2% elite class could effortlessly outvote the 98% 2-to-1 every single time. It was a completely rigged system designed to cheat the commoners out of having any real say. Eventually, you can only push people so far. Fed up with being cheated and completely silenced, the commoners of the Third Estate did something totally unprecedented. They walked out.
Locked out of their usual meeting hall, they literally broke into a nearby indoor tennis court, of all places, and made this famous, defiant promise to stay right there until France had a fair government. This became famously known as the Tennis Court Oath. While inside that tennis court, they actually gave themselves a brand new name, the National Assembly. And listen, this wasn't just a rebrand, it was a massive, earthquake-level shift in ideas. Driven by fresh concepts of equality and freedom, this incredibly brave move showed that people were starting to believe a radical new truth. They believed that the public, the actual people of France, should hold the real power, not some king. And that leads us to our final section, storming the Bastille. So it's July 1789, and terrifying rumors are sweeping through Paris that the king is sending an army to crush this newly formed National Assembly. The people are terrified, yes, but they are also highly mobilized. To protect themselves, an angry, desperate crowd attacks the Bastille on July 14th. They go there specifically to find gunpowder to arm themselves against the king's forces. But they don't just take the gunpowder, they literally tear the entire fortress down with their bare hands, brick by brick.
Now, why the Bastille? Well, it was a massive royal fortress and a prison. And sure, it held the valuable gunpowder they desperately needed, but it was so much more than just a tactical target. The Bastille was this deeply hated, looming symbol of the king's absolute bullying power over the people. Tearing down this massive symbol wasn't just about getting weapons. Its total destruction was the ultimate, undeniable proof that the public was now physically in charge.
And with that monumental event, the perfect storm had finally broken over France. The king's absolute authority was completely shattered by the very people he had ignored. By combining extreme starvation, a totally rigged political system, and the powerful new idea that the people should rule, the spark had ignited. The French Revolution had officially begun. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought to chew on. If completely tearing down a massive royal fortress, brick by brick, was literally only the very first day of the revolution, what on earth happens when millions of hungry, outraged citizens fully realize their own power? That is the terrifying and frankly fascinating question you have to ask yourself, because this explosive first day in 1789 was just the opening scene of a much larger and much bloodier fight for the future of France. Keep that in mind as you continue your studies. Thanks for hanging out and unpacking the perfect storm of the French Revolution with me.